Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist, and this is my second video in my video series on why people stay in dysfunction. This video will focus specifically on playing certain roles that actually enable people to stay in dysfunction. So, more on that in a moment. But first, if you haven't gotten a chance to check out the first video in this video series, it's on the playlist here on my YouTube channel, Why People Stay in Dysfunction. That first video is an introduction to this whole concept. And it's really important to set the foundation, the psychological architecture of why people stay in dysfunctional situations. Check that out. It's really important once you understand some of these foundational components that I'm setting up for you here in the beginning of this video series. It will help your insight and awareness level go up. And that is a major key step toward the whole process of later maybe changing some of your actual behavior. So the insight and the awareness is going to come first. This foundation is critical. And so we're going to talk more today about roles. What we're talking about in the big picture here is that people often stay in dysfunction because they have come to play a certain role. They actually are playing a certain role, and that role has a definition. You'll understand a little bit more about that in a second. But first, let me just kind of take a step back and explain the difference between playing a role and just a one time behavior. So, if, for example, a person engages in a behavior once or twice, it's just an isolated behavior, it's just maybe a one time thing. But when we start to repeat some of the same behaviors over and over and over, that isolated behavior, that one time behavior, can quickly become a pattern. And sometimes that behavior pattern can turn into an actual role you're playing. Now, I want to take a step back just so you can understand this whole idea because it's so important. Roles have particular rules. If a person is playing a role, everyone in their environment expects them to stick to their role. Let me give a super simple example. Take the television show, the super popular worldwide television show Friends. Who hasn't seen the show Friends? Everybody knows on that show, each character plays a very kind of specific type of role, and everybody knows the personalities and behaviors that they would expect from a particular role. Take, for example, Phoebe. Phoebe is the silly, ditzy kind of character, and everybody knows that. Imagine one day if the actress came onto the set and they started to film an episode of that show, and the actress who played Phoebe said to the director, "You know what? This time, actually, I want to do something different. I don't want Phoebe to be silly or ditzy anymore. I want her to be more like Monica. I don't want her to do some of the things that Phoebe used to do." Well, the director would probably look at that actress and say, "Wait, what? You can't do that. That's not your role. That's not what the audience expects from you. You're going to confuse the audience. The audience isn't going to like it if you try to change that role. The audience wants you to stay in the role that you've always been in. It's what they expect." All right, just explaining that to you for that moment, I bet you watching can understand exactly how this applies to people in their own everyday lives, and specifically people who have found themselves in dysfunctional situations, whether in a romantic relationship, in a family dynamic, at work, or just themselves stuck in a really negative, harmful behavior pattern, that they have come to play a certain role, and also that people in their environment have come to expect them to play that role. Now, There are certain roles that people tend to play in dysfunctional situations, in dysfunctional dynamics, and we will have time in the series to get to that more. But for now, I just want to make sure that I mention a few of them to give this some context. Some of the dysfunctional roles that people have often come to play in dysfunction are the martyr, the peacekeeper, the black sheep, the caretaker, and the victim. And we'll talk a little bit more about the really crucial psychological difference between a victim and a survivor, because there's an important difference. And we'll talk more about that, but these are just some of the roles that people play in dysfunctional dynamics. And you can think to yourself, in maybe your own behavior pattern or your own dysfunctional situation that you may be dealing with right now, which of those roles might fit the best? Now, the list doesn't just end there, and we'll talk more about that, but this is just to kind of get you thinking to start. Here's what's important to understand about roles. Roles are limiting. Roles are very limiting in the same way that I gave the example of how the director of the show Friends probably wouldn't be so okay if Phoebe wanted to change her role. It's the same way in people's own personal lives, work lives, wherever it is that they have gotten stuck in this dysfunctional dynamic. Roles are limiting. People usually, when they find themselves playing a set role like this, they're often not being their true, authentic self. They often feel like they have to act or behave or feel in certain ways in order to play that role, or else they're afraid there might be problems. They often feel confined or maybe even claustrophobic, sometimes playing that specific role. Like they wish they didn't have to, but they often feel like they don't have a choice. That's their role. So roles are very, very, very limiting. And I can tell you in over 20 years of experience as a clinical psychologist that usually when people play a set role like this and they've come to be in dysfunction, that playing a role backfires. It can backfire in different ways. And one of the main things that playing a role can cause, and you might relate to this, is it can cause significant resentment. It can cause significant resentment in the person who's playing that role. So if you are somebody stuck in one of these roles, it is very possible that deep down you feel some resentment or maybe even some actual contempt or disdain for the people in your environment who you feel like are keeping you in that dysfunctional role. Now, we're going to be talking more in this series about how true that is. To what extent is it the fault of others? To what extent is it the person in the dysfunction? To what extent is it their responsibility to change it? We're going to talk more about that. That's not easy. This is all a part of understanding the psychological architecture of what goes in to staying in dysfunction. Nobody, I believe, deep down wants to feel resentment, wants to feel contempt or disdain. Those are negative, heavy feelings to carry. People don't really want that. I believe that's not why we're put here on earth, to deal with those feelings, to stay in those feelings, to stay stuck in that dysfunction. I really don't. And all of this is such an important reason why it makes sense to gain insight into this dysfunction. Because if you can see it more clearly, then you can start to understand your role better and then start to possibly make changes toward changing your role if that's something you want. Now, in the next video, what we're going to do is I'm going to start walking you through each of some of the roles that people play in dysfunctional situations so that you can understand that better. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist.